we are going to discuss one of the more ridiculous concepts that we find embedded in mainstream chronological history. Now, the word chronology is really important here, actually, not just because obviously history has a chronology. That's not what I mean. The reality is the Dark Ages add almost 1,000 years to the historical timeline, which means chronology has been way thrown off because of this ridiculous concept that we call the Dark Ages. Now, if you're about to turn this off because you think this is schizo, I promise you it's not schizo. And in this particular episode, I am going to show you hard scientific evidence that proves that the concept of the Dark Ages is ridiculous. Now, another thing to realize about the Dark Ages is not just the concept being absolutely stupid. I mean, the whole idea that humans for almost an entire century did absolutely nothing, and I mean nothing. No cultural advancements, no intellectual advancements. I mean nothing. They just like sat around on stones and banged their head against trees, I guess, for 1,000 years. Right, and that whole concept is dumb. And the reason why it's dumb is because anybody with a half-thinking brain knows that humans will step up and do stuff, right? Some people will sit around and do nothing. I get that. I get there's going to be the idiots out there that don't do anything. But that is not going to be the majority. Humans naturally want to progress. All of us do, right? Every single one of us wants to progress. It's one of the reasons why we have such a horrible depression right now in our society, right? Because nobody can progress because all the progression has been taken up. That's a whole other story. We'll get into that. That's completely different. Although it is relevant to history, and maybe this as well. Okay. So anyway, we cannot have, realistically, humans sitting around for almost 1,000 years doing nothing. That cannot be true. There's no way. The only way you can get away with making that claim is if something horrible really happened. I mean, something would have suppressed humanity for 1,000 years to keep humans down. And that didn't happen. We do not have any evidence that for 1,000 years that something just kept humans down. That didn't happen, all right? So just right there, if we just use common sense will pull us away from the Dark Ages. In fact, common sense pretty much proves the Dark Ages never happened in and of itself. That is literally all you have to do is employ common sense. That's how simple it is to disprove the Dark Ages. There's no reason to believe they existed. But of course, in our modern day and age, you know, you cannot rail against an established authoritative system without being called, a psycho or a schizo or a lunatic or whatever, right? You have to believe that the Dark Ages existed because somebody with a college degree told you that, right? You have no choice. So what we're going to do is we are going to ignore those people because we don't need to listen to liars. Which brings up another point, actually. We do not have to pay attention to people who objectively hold lies as truth. Because finding truth is our number one goal. And the current establishment, the mainstream establishment, they're no longer interested in the truth. As if you probably haven't noticed, right? The more you listen to these people talk, or the more you read of their books, I mean, they're just grabbing at straws everywhere they go nowadays to try to make all of the stuff that we have discovered. They're trying to make all of this objective evidence that we have that proves them wrong. They try to take that stuff and try to fit it into their weird and contorted chronology, and it makes them look ridiculous. And that's what the Dark Ages basically are. So don't be afraid to discard mainstream narratives and knowledge, etc., and look at everything from an objective point of view. All right, enough lecturing. Let's get into this. So we are going to stay objective as we go through some of the science I'm about to show you, and then we're going to reevaluate the Dark Ages and basically get rid of a lot of the ridiculousness that the mainstream pushes forward as fact. Now, here's a quick side note or warning or whatever. I understand if some of you feel uncomfortable with getting rid of the Dark Ages, because just think about what that means. If we are willing to say the Dark Ages didn't happen, like legitimately, and we can prove that the Dark Ages didn't happen, what does that mean for mainstream history? It means that mainstream history is just this huge lie, right? And so many things are built upon this lie. not just, and I don't just mean history books, right? I'm not just talking about, textbooks and professors and stuff like that who've basically been living a lie and profiting off of a lie. But there are other people as well who used these lies to gain all sorts of different various levels of power. Right? So, I mean, people use the Dark Age to substantiate claims to thrones, to substantiate claims to land, to substantiate claims to all kinds of things that were never originally theirs. Now, if something like that is going on in history, how does that affect reality? Right? Because a lot of the stuff that we deal with today are direct results from the corruption that was created in the concept of the Dark Ages. Now that's another thing to think about, and that's probably if you're going to feel scared about it, I could definitely see you being afraid of that. Because if you get rid of all that, that means a lot of the stuff that you have been building your life upon and your family has been building your life upon, or your government or whatever, with your people, that means a lot of that stuff is an objective lie, which means an extension, then your rulers are probably benefiting from that lie as well. And I guarantee that you are not benefiting from that lie. Right? There's a really good chance that you have absolutely not benefited whatsoever from any of these lies. Right? So we all have Stockholm syndrome, right? So the idea is to get out of all of that. So let's go ahead and start breaking down some of the aspects of the Dark Ages and build a scientific foundational case to make the statement that the Dark Ages never happened. So in the last show, we discussed kind of where the Dark Ages originated from. And where they came from was basically the Renaissance. Now, during the time of the Renaissance, there was all kinds of interesting stuff going on, right? There's all kinds of books being written, all kinds of inventions popping up, etc., etc. But one of the other things that was happening during the Renaissance is that it became fashionable to own pieces of work from antiquity. Now, these pieces from antiquity could be anything, right? I mean, they could be pieces of ruins, they could be artworks, they could be statues, stonework, etc. And of course, written works were part of this. Now, everything I just said is a culprit for creating the Dark Ages. But one of the main things that substantiated the Dark Ages were all of the fraudulent tomes that were magically discovered in people's basements all of a sudden. And these tomes, hailed back into the Roman and Greek era and blah, blah, all this garbage. Like, people were just miraculously finding things in the Renaissance. Now, of course, that's not what happened. We know for a scientific fact that forgeries were abound everywhere. This is not debated in mainstream science or history. This is a reality. It's just not talked a lot about. Why wouldn't they talk about it? Why wouldn't mainstream talk about forgeries? You would think that forgeries would be this number one problem that historians would love to tackle, but they don't. In fact, they go out of their way quite often to ignore the forgeries. Now, why would they do that? Well, because nowadays, in today's established, quote unquote, mainstream chronology, a lot of those forgeries and lies are all part of the mainstream chronology. And that is what people have been building their careers off of. Literal lies. I mean, literal garbage. And people know this, by the way. It's funny. I'll have to do another show on the forgery lies that currently exist in our chronology. Not this show. We'll go into other stuff in this show. But the reality is there's a lot of known established forgeries in mainstream, by the way. These are mainstream historians that are calling out the BS. But higher level mainstream people ignore these people. Why do they do that? Because their careers are built on it. It's that simple, right? I mean, nobody wants to lose their livelihood or be proven wrong, right? Ego is a huge problem. And that's why it's important to gain control of your ego. All right, I'm not going to rant about that. But the reality is we now have in the mainstream chronology, we have a situation to where we have a known factual forgeries that have been embedded into what is taught. So that's bad. So the reality is, if you're just even semi-objective, right? You're just semi-objective, and even if you stick to mainstream sources and only mainstream sources, you are going to run into the good scholars in the mainstream that are finding and pointing out these forgeries. So if you follow that trail and that trail only, you don't have to listen to anything else I say from here on out if you don't believe me. But if you're looking for a way to get into this before we go into what I'm going to get into eventually here in this show, you can literally just follow mainstream historians and see what they're calling out. And that should be enough to, I would say, make you question your reality and what you believe in. Like, that really should be enough. But we're going to take it further, right? We know there's forgeries. We know all that stuff. Okay, great. And we'll get into forgeries later. But here, I want to talk about some of the more basic foundational level sciences that prove that the Dark Ages never happened. So let's start at the literal ground floor of the Dark Ages, and that would be stratigraphy. Now, stratigraphy is interesting because stratigraphy is something that mainstream historians, archaeologists, etc., they live and die by. They really love stratigraphy. And I agree, stratigraphy is very fascinating. In fact, it's one of the backbones that proves that the vast majority of history, not just the Dark Ages, but I mean the vast majority of history is a lie. But let's just focus on the Dark Ages, obviously. So stratigraphy, the basics of this is that over time, layers, cultural layers, they call them cultural layers now, layers of dirt, debris, rock, etc., build up over time. And each one of these layers is supposed to represent a specific time chronologically. Now, basic mainstream geology says that yes, over time, you have layers of dirt, rock, etc. will build up on top of each other, and then you can kind of use those layers of rock as a time machine, basically, right? You can slice it in half, look in there, look at the layers, see what's in the layers, and then you can pull out the information and date whatever's in there. Now, the concept of stratigraphy is very convincing even for people who don't care about the concept, right? I mean, your average person can absolutely understand, stratigraphy. All right, layers build up, blah, blah, blah. Yes, the older ones are on the bottom. The newer ones would be on the top, and they're done. Now, what this does, interestingly enough, is that this can create a false sense of intellectual security. Right? I mean, the concept of stratigraphy seems very logical, very, very easy to grasp, and everybody, it's easy to buy into as well. And then if you get some people who are perceived to be highly intelligent and masters of their field, and suddenly these people start dating these layers, and a couple of other high-level authoritative people jump on in, and they agree with those, basically, suddenly you get a consensus, right? And this consensus you feel comfortable with because it's being generated by basic logic. Layers are logical. Okay, I get that. And then if you have really high-level authoritative people from universities corroborating the actual dates per layer, how could you be wrong? How could this possibly be wrong, right? Okay, so what I wanted, the only reason why I say any of that in the first place, by the way, is because I'm not dogging on stratigraphy. Stratigraphy is extremely important, and we're going to use it here to destroy the Dark Ages. But one of the things I want everybody to understand is that stratigraphy is not locked in the way the mainstream would have you believe. So right now, we find ourselves in a period of time to where you're not allowed to question or bring up problems with mainstream established stratigraphy. And that goes for basically any mainstream concept nowadays. But the stratigraphical record, in the way that it is presented now, you're basically not allowed to question it. All right, now that's a problem. And of course, the further you go back in time, the weirder stratigraphy gets, and the harder it is to date that stuff. Make no mistake, by the way, this is another thing I want to make sure everybody understands. The further back you go in the stratigraphical record, the more difficult it is to date stuff. Now, right now, mainstream geology holds that everything takes millions and billions of years to form. All right, and for you atheists out there, no, I do not believe in God or young earth creation or whatever. What I'm saying, though, is that we do not have any actual proof that this stuff took billions of years. We have no idea. We have no proof. In fact, there's so many unknowns in geology that geologists try to play off as if they do know. that it's amazing that anything is taught at all in geology as it is. There's so many problems with dating layers and stratigraphical records the further back you go, that nobody should be applying dates at all. There should not be a single date past a certain point. I mean, that's just the scientific reality. All right, we'll go into maybe some of that later. All right, so, but we can date newer stratigraphy better, right? Makes sense, right? If it's not as old, then, you know, it should be less hard to date. And with any luck, there might even be humans around that maybe even saw some of those layers get made, right? Maybe somebody saw a volcano erupt and it laid down a layer of ash, right? People always say, oh, there's a layer of ash, so that's, you know, volcano went off at this point in time, and that's all that could have happened, right? Okay, fine. We'll get into that as well. No, wait, actually, let's get into it right now. So, using the volcano example I just said, if a volcano goes off and layers down ash everywhere, right? Does that ash just sit there and get solidified magically? No, you need another layer to come and lock it down. Otherwise, you're going to have environmental factors that will get rid of the ash. And it's not going to take millions of years to get rid of the ash. You know, in a person's lifetime, ash can be gone, right? I mean, I can't count how many, like, layers of ash that I've seen fall down on my town from fires and stuff. And if I go back right now to prove that those fires took place using layers of ash, I would never find anything. There's nothing there. The ash is gone. Why is the ash gone? Because of natural, processes, man. Wind will blow away ash. So for you to get your layer of ash, you need something like a pyroclastic flow. You need something extremely hot to lock it into place, right? Because the ash that falls, or the whatever happened, with the volcano in this example, there needs to be something that locks that debris in. You need another layer of something on top of it, right? And people just think that this layer stuff magically happens. I mean, all we have to do is look around right now in our life, and we can see that you're not having layers build up right in front of you constantly, right? You are not walking into the street and going, oh crap, another cultural layer just appeared. Let me sweep it out of here. That's not happening. It's not going on. And it's not going on anywhere. You can walk anywhere. You can walk all over the place out, even in the wilderness, and there aren't, we do not have evidence of just feet and feet and feet of random debris suddenly just building up over time. It does not exist. In fact, it's quite the opposite in a lot of cases, right? Because we have constant erosional processes going on this planet. Which brings up another point. How is it that cultural layers or stratigraphical layers are somehow being immune to all the erosive properties of the planet? Like, how is that happening? How are these layers building up and essentially being untouched by erosion? Right? That's just something to think about, because it is a legitimate question to ask from a scientific perspective if you're going to believe the mainstream concept of how layers build up, right? Layers build up over millions of years. All right, so the first thing that's interesting is that we know for a fact that layers can literally build up overnight. Minutes. It does not take millions and billions of years. And I've already done a video on that scientifically shows you visually through experimentation how quickly layers can grow and how quickly they can bed themselves, right? So this is important. You're probably wondering what the hell I'm talking about and why I'm bringing that up, as if it's detrimental to my case or something. It's actually very, very beneficial. But we know scientifically that layers build up very quickly, right? And we see it in nature, right? We can see that with certain kinds of flooding and flows out there. So we've observed it in nature, and we've observed it and recreated it in the laboratory. So it doesn't take millions and billions of years to pop up. So when we start looking at stratigraphy of, say, like the Greek, Roman Empire, anybody that existed a few thousand years ago, when we start looking at their stratigraphy and we see that their houses, their buildings, their sites are buried under dozens, if not hundreds of feet of stratigraphical layers, how did we get dozens to hundreds of feet in only a few thousand years, right? Why was the Colosseum, for example, buried under mud at all? Like, what? Why is that buried under anything? I mean, so what is that, right? And we find stuff buried under all kinds of things. And we know for a fact that it did not take millions and billions of years for all of those layers to build up. So where am I going with this? The point here is that when we see cultural layers, when we see that stratigraphy from places like Greece, any place, doesn't matter, Aztec, Mayan, Tartarian, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter where you're at. When you're going back a few thousand to 5,000-ish years or so, and you're finding all of these structures and archaeological treasures under dozens to not hundreds of feet of layering, we have ourselves a geological conundrum. Because what this implies is one of two things. The first thing, if you're a geologist, you have to say, well, I guess the Romans must be like 1,000,000 years old because there's literally 24 feet burying this Roman site. And, how the hell did 24 feet worth of cultural layers appear in only a few thousand years? Right? That's crazy. That is insane for a mainstream geologist, because for them, everything takes millions and billions of years. Now, on the other hand, we have archaeologists. When archaeologists look at their stratigraphy, they're calibrating their dates using either dendrochronology or carbon dating, which is all garbage, horrible ways of dating things. And they all just go into circular logic where they just kind of prop each other up. And then they go and they date these layers. And they date like Roman layers to, it's like 1,000 years old or 3,000 years old or whatever, right? It's only a few thousand years old. They are not millions of years old. So right here, we have a weird conundrum. We have geologists, mainstream geologists, saying that it takes millions and billions of years for all kinds of layers to build up. We can't have that, since that's not what we're finding if we have relatively newer sites buried under dozens, if not hundreds of feet of layering. So they can't be that old. We know they're not that old. So geologists are in a pickle. Archaeologists are in a pickle because now they're against the geologists, and the archaeologists are just dating it however they want to date it, so that they can get their dates for their civilization that they know, quote unquote, is true. Now these two now start to butt heads. What neither one stops to think about is how the hell did all of these layers get on top of relatively new structures? How did that happen? What is going on? Archaeologists just take this for granted, right? They just take the fact that there's multiple layers of crap buried on top of structures, and they don't even think about it. They're just like, oh yeah, it's stratigraphy. We just look at this and we get our magical date and we move on, right? We go and we drink and we get our diplomas. That is what they do, and they don't care about anything else because they got the date that they were looking for specifically, right? So we have a problem with both archaeology and geology. Now, this brings me up to the next point. We know for a fact that layers can be built up overnight, minutes. It does not take millions and billions of years to create a multitude of layers. But where does that leave us then? Then we are left with the fact that these layers may have been created rather quickly. And how do you get layers like that to be created rather quickly? How the hell do you bury Roman structures or Greek structures under dozens, if not hundreds of feet of layering in only a few thousand years? And what's even more interesting is that it probably wasn't even over a couple of thousand years. It had to have been quicker, because otherwise people closer to our time frame would have spoken about layers being piled up rather quickly. So wherever these layers came from, they had to have been created fast. Now, what you see on your screen right now is the stratigraphy of Rome at Forum Romanum. Now, I want to give full credit to Gunnar Heinzsong for these slides that I'm going to use in this show and other shows forever. Gunnar Heinzsong was an amazing chronologist who passed away recently, but he released all of his information for free to be used just like this. So I want to make sure that he is given his credit. Also, go find his videos. It's absolutely amazing. He is right on the right track. Anyway, go find his videos on your own. Anyway, so what we have here is some Roman stratigraphy. Now, this stratigraphy is from the Trajan Forum in Rome. All right, the floor of the Imperial Antiquity, where you see the Piano Antico down at the very bottom of the layer, is from the 2nd and 3rd century AD. This is immediately covered by a level of what they call fango. It's a dark stratigraphical layer, dark mud or dark earth, they call it. Now, this fango is vaguely dated to the 9th, 10th century AD. All right, so in the heart of Rome, there are no remains for the periods of late antiquity, that's the 3rd to 6th, 7th century AD, as well as the early Middle Ages. And that would be like the 8th to early 10th century AD. So basically what we are led to believe from scientists and archaeologists and historians' own evidence is that they say the 2nd century AD immediately to the 9th century, 10th century AD. So basically nothing happens at all for about 500, 600, 700 years between those two layers. But what's even weirder is that no layers at all are there. So here is the problem with mainstream's garbage. So what mainstream is basically telling us is that we have 2 layers which are basically supposed to be about 600, 700, maybe 800 years apart. They land right on top of one another with nothing in between. So magically you have 0 layers between the 2nd century and the 10th century. Then magically, if you look at this chart, and remember these dates are mainstream dates you see up here, then you start to see that layers suddenly magically start to grow again, right? You see the 10th century and then it goes on up from there. So basically the mainstream is telling us that for whatever reason, not only did humans not do anything for all of those 1,000 years, but neither did Earth. There were no layers being built up. There were no geological events built. There was just nothing. Just suddenly, magically, the entire world decided to stop operating. That is literally the mainstream's perspective on the stratigraphical record. They literally believe that everything just stopped for 1,000 years. That's it. That's what the mainstream believes. That's what their horrible dating methods do. If, instead, we look at the evidence for what it is, what we can then say is that these dates are not correct. These mainstream dates that they are giving us right here, the way the mainstream dates these stratigraphical layers, are wrong. Now, if these stratigraphical layers are wrong, that immediately tells us that the entire chronological history that we currently have embedded into society is subsequently wrong as well. It's right there. There's the data. There's nothing to argue about. It is right there. The mainstream is completely wrong. And they are coping at a level which is just absolutely insane. Now, I know it took me like 40 minutes to get to like this point, the end of the stratigraphical record part, but this is the meat and potatoes right here. We'll cut it off here because I've been talking and ranting way too long. We'll keep going into the stratigraphy, and then we'll start getting into more of the artifacts as well that prove that the Dark Ages absolutely never happened and that the entire thing is a lie. And we will prove it scientifically. Not only that, but this also begins to show us the layers of the catastrophes that took place back in these ages that wiped out humanity during this time. The real science is right there, and there's nothing to argue about. Now, we'll get into that on the next show.